When the ocean is calm, we feel safe. But some waves carry secrets. On-board luxury cruise ships where laughter echoes through lavish halls and champagne glasses clink under the stars, darkness still finds a way in. These are not stories of storms or shipwrecks, but of quiet deaths, vanished passengers, and questions that no ocean can drown. If you're drawn to real mysteries, haunting crimes, and eerie truths that linger long after the headlines fade, subscribe to Roadside Tales. We tell the stories that others leave behind. Case 1. George Smith. The honeymoon that ended in blood. It was supposed to be the happiest week of his life. George Smith IV, 26 years old, had just married Jennifer Hagel. Young, energetic, and in love, they chose to celebrate their honeymoon aboard the Brilliance of the Seas, a luxury cruise ship operated by Royal Caribbean. The ship departed from Barcelona on June 29, 2005, with stops across the Mediterranean, Italy, Greece, Turkey. They booked cabin 9262, balcony view, ocean breeze. For George, a Connecticut native and heir to a successful family liquor business, it was the perfect beginning to forever. But forever ended on July 5th. That morning, as the ship sailed quietly through open waters, passengers began to whisper. On the exterior wall of Deck 9, directly below George's balcony, a large, dark smear stretched down the white hull. Crew members quickly cordoned off the area. Security tightened. An announcement came over the intercom: a passenger was missing. George Smith had vanished overnight. The evening before, George and Jennifer had dinner together, followed by drinks in the ship's casino. Surveillance footage showed them laughing relaxed. George was seen at the blackjack table, drink in hand. At some point, they met 4 other passengers, young men from Brooklyn, all in their 20s, traveling together. Their names were Rusty Kaufman, Greg Rosenberg, Zach Rosenberg, and Josh Askin. Witnesses say everyone had been drinking heavily. At around 3:45 a.m., George was escorted back to his cabin by some members of the group. According to Josh Askin, George was extremely intoxicated, barely able to stand. Josh claimed he helped George into bed and left him there groaning and incoherent. Jennifer was not present. She had reportedly become separated from George earlier and ended up sleeping elsewhere. By sunrise, George was gone. What caught everyone's attention wasn't just the disappearance, it was the blood. A thick smear ran down the ship's hull, starting just below George's balcony. Inside the cabin, there were more traces on the carpet, the bed near the balcony railing. The balcony door was unlocked. The railing itself stood just over waist height. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken furniture, just silence and stains that told a story no one was ready to explain. Jennifer Hagel was found in another area of the ship around 4:30 a.m. Crew members discovered her passed out in a hallway, disoriented. She was taken to the medical bay. When she awoke, she was informed that her husband was missing. The ship's security team began interviews, but there was no sense of urgency. George's cabin was not preserved as a crime scene. The sheets were laundered. The room was cleaned and reassigned to new guests within days. Video footage from that night was incomplete. Some angles were missing. Others showed fragments, people passing through hallways, doors opening and closing, but nothing conclusive. The 4 young men who were last seen with George were questioned and released. Their accounts were inconsistent. Some claimed they left George alone. Others suggested he might have fallen by accident. A neighboring passenger reported hearing a loud thud from the cabin around 4:00 a.m., like something heavy being dropped. Another said they heard laughter and what sounded like a struggle, but without solid evidence, no charges were filed. Jennifer returned home not long after. Her behavior raised questions. She didn't speak publicly. She accepted a $1.1 million settlement from Royal Caribbean, which included a confidentiality agreement. She claimed the cruise line had mishandled the case. Others wondered if she was hiding something. Over time, attention turned to the group of men last seen with George. In 2006, a disturbing video surfaced filmed on the cruise. In it, voices are heard joking about someone falling overboard. The footage was grainy, faces were unclear, but the implications were unsettling. Still, the case went cold. Then came a sworn deposition in 2012. Josh Askin reaffirmed his earlier story. He had helped George to bed, then left. He claimed the other men had returned to their rooms, but discrepancies remained. Timelines didn't line up. Witnesses remembered hearing footsteps and movement long after Josh said he was gone. Investigators floated three main theories. The first, accident. George, heavily intoxicated, stumbled out to the balcony and fell overboard. Simple. Tragic. No foul play. The second, murder. George was attacked, perhaps by one or more of the men, with a struggle that ended at the balcony. The blood inside the room supported this theory. The third, a cover-up. Something happened that night, an altercation, a fight, a robbery, and instead of reporting it, those involved agreed to stay silent. They had hours before anyone noticed, enough time to clean up, enough time to walk away. George's body was never recovered. The Mediterranean is vast, the currents are strong, and once he went overboard, if he did, he was gone. His parents never gave up. They created a website, offered a reward, appeared on television. They believed their son was murdered, that he was left to die, and that someone, maybe multiple people, knows exactly what happened. But they also believe that silence has been bought, that deals were made behind closed doors, and that the truth was swallowed by the same sea that took their son. What made the case even more frustrating for investigators was the lack of proper crime scene handling in the crucial first hours. Cruise staff, perhaps untrained or simply following corporate protocols, had the cabin cleaned before forensic teams could properly document it. Housekeeping replaced the bedding, vacuumed the carpet, and restocked the minibar. The few blood samples that were collected had already been diluted or compromised. To those watching from the outside, it appeared as if the cruise line was more interested in keeping the voyage smooth than uncovering the truth. Royal Caribbean's public statements were careful and non-committal. They expressed condolences. They insisted they had cooperated with authorities. But behind the scenes, lawyers were already working. Statements were filtered through legal teams. Media access was limited. When asked why more wasn't done to preserve evidence, the cruise line cited operational procedures and guest privacy. The Smith family was outraged. They went on national television. They demanded congressional hearings. They hired private investigators. Their campaign wasn't just about George. It became a larger battle over cruise ship safety, transparency, and accountability. They believed George had been murdered and that the cruise line's mishandling allowed his killers to walk free. Reporters covering the case uncovered more strange details. The cruise line had failed to promptly notify the FBI. There were gaps in the timeline, missing logs, and inconsistencies in crew reports. The security footage released to the family was incomplete. Key portions were missing or had inexplicably been taped over. There was also a curious moment when one of the young men in the group was seen carrying what looked like a towel, wrapped tightly in both hands, walking quickly down a hallway just before sunrise. When questioned, he said it was just laundry, but no one ever found the towel. Despite mounting pressure, the FBI eventually closed its investigation in 2015, 10 years after George disappeared, citing lack of evidence. No arrests, no suspects, no charges. To this day, the case remains officially unsolved. But in the quiet corners of true crime forums and among the community of maritime investigators, the consensus is rarely neutral. Many believe that George Smith did not fall. They believe that something happened in that room, an altercation, a drunken confrontation, and that the truth was quickly buried both figuratively and literally beneath layers of legal settlements and washed bed sheets. Jennifer Hagel has always maintained that she had nothing to do with her husband's death. She has rebuilt her life. But to George's family, her silence and settlement still raise unanswered questions. Why didn't she push harder for justice? Why did she sign away her right to speak? What does she know that she hasn't said? The brilliance of the seas still sails. It still carries passengers across the same waters. Cabin 9062, once a place of laughter and celebration, now exists as just another room with a view. Most guests have never heard of George Smith, but some, when passing that balcony, pause a little longer. They look down at the sea and wonder. George Smith IV stepped onto a luxury cruise with dreams of a future. He vanished into the night, leaving behind only a stain and a silence that continues to echo across the waves. Case 2. Shirley McGill, The Quiet Death, in Cabin 923. It was a summer cruise just off the coast of California. The Carnival elation was a floating city of laughter casinos, midnight buffets, and the kind of soft artificial peace that only exists miles from shore. Among the nearly 3,000 passengers aboard, Robert and Shirley McGill didn't stand out. They were middle-aged, quiet, and kept to themselves. No one noticed anything unusual until the blood started to seep under the cabin door. Shirley McGill was 55 years old. She worked for the California Department of Motor Vehicles, organized, soft-spoken, known for her kindness. She had recently married Robert McGill, a man she had dated years earlier and reunited with later in life. Friends described them as a little mismatched. Shirley was grounded, practical. Robert had a temper, but no one expected what would happen on that trip. On July 14, 2009, the Carnival elation was nearing the end of its 5-day voyage to Cabo San Lucas and back. The ship had departed San Diego and was making its return leg. The couple had a balcony cabin number 923. That morning, something changed. At around 5:45 p.m., passengers in the hallway heard loud voices. One said it sounded like a man yelling. Another described a strange thud, but no one reacted. Cruise ships are full of noise doors, slamming music, playing, people partying. Most guests brushed it off, but minutes later, Robert McGill walked out of the cabin. He was calm, composed. He took the elevator down several floors. He passed other passengers without speaking. Then, according to reports, he walked into the nearest bar, sat down, and ordered a drink. The bartender noticed something odd. McGill seemed distant. His hands were shaking slightly, and then in a flat voice he said the words, "No one expected. I just killed my wife." At first they thought it was a joke. The bartender laughed nervously. McGill didn't smile. He repeated himself, slowly, clearly. "No, I really did. She's in the room. I strangled her." Security was notified. Within minutes, Carnival staff escorted him to an isolated room and called the ship's medical team. Meanwhile, a crew member was sent to cabin 923. What they found inside was grisly. Shirley McGill was lying on the bathroom floor. She had been strangled with such force that there were deep bruises across her neck and collarbone. Her eyes were open. One arm was curled beneath her as if she'd tried to protect herself. There were signs of a struggle. Overturned toiletries, a shattered glass, a smear of blood along the tile. But no one had heard her scream. Ship personnel secured the cabin. The captain was notified. Carnival immediately contacted the FBI and Coast Guard as the ship was still in U.S. territorial waters. They placed Robert McGill under watch until the ship docked in San Diego the next day. The rest of the passengers, however, weren't told anything. The cruise continued. The shows played on. The pool deck stayed open. Guests passed by cabin 923, not knowing that just beyond that door, a woman's life had ended violently and quietly. Once docked, federal agents boarded the vessel. McGill was taken into custody without incident. He offered no resistance, no explanation, just the same calm confession. Investigators began piecing together the last few days. According to crew members, Robert and Shirley had dined together regularly, but there had been tension. One waiter said Robert appeared angry during breakfast the day before. Another said Shirley had walked alone on the upper deck that morning looking upset. When questioned, McGill told agents they had argued. He said it started over something stupid. Voices were raised. She told him he was drinking too much. He told her to stop nagging. He said she made him feel trapped. Then, according to his confession, he snapped. "I grabbed her. I put my hands around her neck. I didn't stop. I just wanted her to be quiet. There was no mention of premeditation. No weapon, no intent to hide the body. McGill claimed it was a moment of blind rage. But what unsettled investigators most wasn't just the act, it was his demeanor. Cold, flat, emotionless. When asked if he regretted it, he simply said, "I don't know." Shirley's family was devastated. They had expected her home the next day. Instead, they received a phone call from federal authorities. Her body was transferred off the ship under a tarp. No announcement, no ceremony. Passengers lined up at customs, unaware that someone among them had spent the last day of the cruise lying dead in her bathroom. Robert McGill was charged with first-degree murder. At trial, his attorneys argued for diminished capacity. They claimed he had a long history of untreated mental health issues. They said he had felt isolated, overwhelmed, that the cruise had amplified a sense of claustrophobia and helplessness, that the alcohol didn't help. But the jury didn't buy it. In 2010, Robert McGill was convicted and sentenced to life in federal prison. The judge during sentencing said his actions were brutal, deliberate, and cowardly. What haunts this case isn't just the murder, it's the context. A cruise ship is a sealed world. There's nowhere to run. No one hears you unless they're already listening. And in that cabin behind a locked door, a woman was murdered by the person she trusted most. Passengers later expressed shock. Some had seen the couple by the buffet. Others remembered standing next to Robert in line at the casino. He looked normal, one woman said. You'd never guess. But that's the thing. You don't guess. You never really know who's in the cabin next to yours, who's walking by you on the deck, who's sitting quietly at the bar hiding something that's already been done. What made the incident even more chilling was how little it disrupted the flow of the voyage. The entertainment schedule remained unchanged. The dining room served dinner as usual. There were no announcements, no memorial, no mention of what had occurred. Only a small handful of passengers even realized something was wrong. By the time they docked, most of the ship had moved on. For investigators, one of the most troubling aspects of the case was the simplicity of the crime. There was no elaborate plan, no effort to cover it up. Robert McGill had killed his wife in a moment of rage and then ordered a drink. He didn't try to run. He didn't weep. He didn't seem confused. It was as though in that moment something inside him simply shut off. His criminal history was almost non-existent. There were no documented incidents of domestic violence, no restraining orders, no public red flags. That perhaps is what made it so unsettling. He had no past to warn anyone, no record to justify suspicion. He simply snapped, and someone died. Psychologists who later analyzed the case pointed to what's known as situational violence, a phenomenon where someone without a history of aggression becomes violent due to acute emotional or environmental stress. Triggers like alcohol isolation and relational conflict can cause a total loss of impulse control, especially in an environment like a cruise ship confined, unfamiliar, and emotionally charged. And yet, even with that explanation, there were still questions. Why had no one stepped in? Why hadn't anyone reported the earlier arguments? Why didn't the cruise line intervene when staff noticed tension between the couple? Carnival later stated that they had followed all appropriate protocols. But protocols don't always catch danger in time. In a ship with thousands of guests, one moment of silence can mean the difference between life and death. Shirley's death became a footnote in maritime legal circles. It was referenced in discussions about cruise ship jurisdiction, the limitations of onboard security, and the psychological pressures of travel. But beyond the headlines and hearings, it was a deeply personal tragedy. A woman had taken a vacation with the man she loved and never returned. Her family chose not to speak to the media extensively. They held a quiet funeral, closed casket. They wanted peace, but justice alone could not offer it. What they were left with were photographs, voicemail messages, and a dozen quiet questions that may never be answered. Robert McGill remains in federal prison serving a life sentence. He rarely speaks. In one interview, he said, "It's like watching someone else's life happen from the inside. Whether that was regret detachment or simply another form of escape, no one knows." Cabin 923 remains part of Carnival's booking rotation. If you search for it, there's no mention of what happened. It's just another number in a sea of rooms. But the walls remember, even if the guests do not. Case 3. Anila Bitri-Papa. The Death Beneath the Deck. Anila Bitri-Papa was a name few Americans recognized in 2018. But in Albania, she was well known, a diplomat respected and refined, having served as the Albanian Consul General in New York. She was accomplished, articulate, and highly regarded by her government and community. That made what happened aboard the Carnival Elation all the more chilling. In early December 2018, Anila boarded the cruise ship for a vacation unlike the diplomatic functions she was used to. The Carnival Elation was headed for the Bahamas. It wasn't her first cruise, and according to those who knew her, she had looked forward to the break. She was traveling alone, a detail that would later spark more questions than answers. The ship left Jacksonville, Florida, on a routine schedule. Everything seemed normal. She was seen enjoying meals, taking short walks along the upper deck, reading by herself. Nothing out of the ordinary. She wasn't known to drink excessively, wasn't involved with anyone romantically aboard, and had no signs of distress. But on December 14th, just one day before the cruise was set to return, Anila Bitri-Papa was found dead inside her cabin. The announcement came abruptly. Passengers were not informed immediately. The ship's captain relayed the news to U.S. Coast Guard officials, and the cruise continued its course toward Florida without disruption. For those on board, the trip ended as it always did, with drinks, farewells, and disembarkation. Behind the scenes, however, something else was unfolding. When the Carnival Elation docked, federal authorities were waiting. The FBI was called in, and a preliminary investigation began, quiet, swift, and with minimal public detail. It was only after the ship returned that the Carnival Cruise Line confirmed the incident. A 50-year-old woman had died. They did not name her. They gave no cause. Just a short statement confirming that a guest was found deceased in her stateroom and that authorities were reviewing the matter. That guest was Anila Bitri-Papa. The first clue that her death might not have been as straightforward as the cruise line implied came from the reaction of the Albanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. They did not accept the story as is. In fact, they issued a public statement expressing concern, demanding that U.S. authorities thoroughly investigate the circumstances. In diplomatic language, that's a loud alarm bell. At first, the working theory was natural causes, perhaps a heart attack, perhaps a stroke. An autopsy was performed in Florida. According to the report, there were no immediate signs of trauma. But other findings were kept confidential. Her family, particularly, her sister, began pressing for answers. They didn't believe she had any medical conditions that would explain a sudden death. She had passed her last diplomatic medical review without issue. There had been no warnings, no complaints, just silence. And then the announcement of her death. Then came the inconsistencies. Ship staff reportedly didn't discover her until late in the morning hours after routine check-ins. Some said they found her fully clothed, lying across the bed. Others claimed she was partially undressed. One rumor even suggested the cabin had been disturbed, though Carnival denied any foul play. The FBI's involvement was brief. After a few days, they announced there were no indications of criminal activity and handed the case back to local authorities. That statement left a void, and into that void speculation rushed in. Some believed she may have been poisoned, a theory fueled by the secrecy around the toxicology results. Others suspected she had suffered an aneurysm or undiagnosed medical condition. But even then, the lack of clarity around when exactly she died, how long it took for her body to be found, and who last saw her alive left gaps. Most troubling for her family was the handling of her belongings. Several personal items, including her phone and jewelry, were returned after a delay. But data on her phone had reportedly been wiped. Whether that was due to a technical glitch security procedure or something more suspicious was never explained. In Albania, public mourning quickly gave way to frustration. Commentators asked how someone of her stature, a diplomat with protection under international convention, could die in international waters under unclear circumstances and receive so little scrutiny. Protests were held in her hometown. Members of parliament demanded answers from both American and Albanian officials. But no new information came. Carnival maintained its standard line, no signs of foul play, fully cooperating with authorities. The FBI remained silent, and in time the story faded from headlines. Behind the scenes, Anila's family sought independent counsel. They attempted to obtain the full cabin surveillance logs, which according to insiders exist for every stateroom corridor and are time-stamped. But those records were not released. Cruise lines are not obligated to turn over internal data unless subpoenaed, and in cases without clear criminal suspicion, such subpoenas are rare. What haunted her loved ones most was the stillness, the sterile neutrality with which her death was processed. No suspects, no crime scene, no evidence. Just a woman traveling alone found dead on a ship that kept moving forward. For a time, internet sleuths tried to revive the case. It became a footnote in cruise crime threads, often paired with other unsolved or ambiguous cruise ship deaths. But Anila's case stood out because of who she was, an educated, careful, respected official, not a reckless partygoer or troubled tourist. If it could happen to her, people wondered who was safe. In the aftermath of her death, questions continued to echo not just among her relatives, but also in niche online forums that focus on cruise ship incidents. These communities pointed out how cruise ships, despite being luxurious and high-tech, often lack transparent oversight when it comes to handling onboard emergencies. Many drew parallels between Anila's case and previous deaths at sea cases that were similarly filed away under the vague label of natural causes, despite inconsistencies. One retired cruise employee speaking anonymously noted that the protocol for in-cabin medical emergencies could be painfully slow depending on the crew's training and the availability of the ship's lone doctor. If something goes wrong at 2 a.m. and it's not loud or messy, chances are nobody knows until it's too late. They said there were also logistical concerns. The body, once removed, was kept on the ship's morgue level until docking. Her family wasn't allowed to see her until after the body was transferred to a Florida coroner's office. When they did, they claimed there were small bruises on her wrist and collarbone, subtle but troubling. The coroner, however, ruled them non-specific and not indicative of foul play. Further complicating the issue was the fact that cruise lines are private corporations, and under maritime law they have immense control over internal documentation. Passenger logs, crew statements, and even surveillance footage are not automatically turned over unless compelled by law enforcement. Since no crime was officially suspected, none of those records became public. Anila's sister eventually wrote to her local congressional representative, urging an inquiry into how cruise ship deaths are handled. A brief letter of acknowledgement was issued, but no formal investigation followed. It became another brick in the wall of systemic ambiguity surrounding deaths at sea. Journalists who attempted to revisit the case were often met with roadblocks. Carnival refused to issue further comments, citing the privacy of the family, even when it was the family itself requesting more transparency. FOIA requests for any FBI involvement returned blank or heavily redacted documents with entire paragraphs blacked out. For those who followed the story, the most haunting part wasn't the lack of answers. It was how easily her death was absorbed by the ocean of bureaucracy. One day she was a passenger with a name, a history, a future. The next, she was a line item on an incident report. No protest, no noise, just silence. And in that silence, the sea rolled on. Today, if you board the Carnival Elation and walk past stateroom 724, there's nothing to suggest what happened there. The sheets are fresh, the key card works, the view is still spectacular. But for one family and for anyone who's ever felt how deep a mystery can go when left untold, there is a shadow beneath the surface, and it has a name. Anila Bitri-Papa. Gone, but not forgotten, and never fully explained. 3 stories, 3 ships, 1 grim reminder. Even in places built for pleasure, danger doesn't knock. It drifts in, quietly hides beneath the surface, and sometimes never leaves. If these true stories stay with you, subscribe to Roadside Tales, because the most chilling crimes aren't always committed in the dark. Sometimes they happen in plain sight, on the water,